want to welcome you all to our first webinar in this new series. We're so glad you're here with us today. We will walk through in this webinar series the essentials for creating a sub-regional plan. Great to see folks from all over, lots of local jurisdictions and other agencies. So we're really happy to have you all today. My name is Dana Breckwald. I'm Assistant Planning Director for Climate Adaptation. This webinar series was developed in response to a lot of the questions that we've been hearing during our initial consultation meetings, and it's designed to help jurisdictions understand what's expected from each element submission and then provide you guidance on how to approach each of these elements. So this webinar focuses on the first two elements, since that's where most jurisdictions are now or will be soon, and future webinars will cover the remaining elements. But for today, let's focus on elements A, the planning process, and element B, existing conditions. So before we dive in, just a couple of quick notes about how the webinar will run. We'd love for you to use the chat to share your thoughts and respond to the interactive questions we'll be asking. But if you have a question for the presenters that you want us to address in the Q&A portion at the end, please drop that in the official Q&A box so we don't miss it. You can find the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. It looks like a little speech bubble with a question mark. And feel free to submit questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll try to get to all of them during the Q&A section at the end. And then after the webinar, we'll post a written Q&A document to our website, which will include all the questions that we answered live today, as well as any questions we weren't able to get to answering live. So now I want to introduce the team members you'll be hearing from today. I'm joined by Juliet Chaussen and Sabrina Lopez, who are new faces on our team, but you'll be seeing a lot more of them throughout your sub-regional planning process. And we're also joined by Todd Hallenbeck, who is our GIS specialist lead. And all of us are part of the planning team at the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, BCDC. And if you aren't yet familiar with BCDC, we are a state agency with planning and regulatory authority over the San Francisco Bay and its shoreline. So here's what we'll cover in today's session. Now we're giving you a little introduction and goals for the webinar. Next, in part one, we'll provide a quick refresher on the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan, or RSAP, to just ensure we all have the same context for the rest of the webinar. In part two, we'll dive into element A, the planning process, and then part three will be element B, existing conditions. We'll walk through what each element includes and how to approach each of these elements. We'll wrap up with key takeaways from the session and then open the floor for questions and answers. So before we get started, let's take a moment to review what we hope you get out of this webinar. First, we want to make sure that you are refreshed on the purpose and structure of the RSAP, make sure that everyone is on the same page. Next, we want to highlight tools, resources, and strategies that can help you move through the planning process. And finally, we want to clarify expectations and provide practical guidance for creating sub-regional plan element A, the planning process, and B, existing conditions, to help you know what we're expecting from you and how to get started. So from here, I'll pass it over to Sabrina Lopez, who will walk us through part one, a refresher on the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan.
Okay, thank you, Dana, and hi, everybody. My name is Sabrina Lopez, and I'm a climate adaptation planner at BCDC. And in this section, I'm going to go over the purpose and structure of the RSAP and how it supports subregional planning. Before we dive into it, we first want to hear from you. How familiar are you with the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan? Are you very familiar, somewhat familiar, not yet familiar? Go ahead and drop your answers in the chat, and we'll take a moment to see what everyone is saying. I'm seeing somewhat, lots of somewhats, very, a couple familiar. Keep them coming. Some somewhats. Okay. Um, Well, thank you everyone for sharing. This is really helpful and it gives us a sense of where everyone is starting from. So now let's dive into the RSAP and review its purpose, structure, and some tools to support planning. So just for a little background, in 2023, Senate Bill 272 became law, requiring local governments along the outer coast and in the San Francisco Bay to develop sea level rise adaptation plans by January 1st, 2034. BCDC was tasked with creating the planning guidelines for San Francisco Bay jurisdictions and reviewing submitted plans to either approve or deny them based on how well they align with those guidelines. Also, an important incentive to note is that projects included in approved plans are prioritized for state funding. So the work you do now can translate into real on the ground actions that protect communities for years to come. To provide guidance and clarify what's required under SB 272, BCDC developed the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan, otherwise known as RSAP. At its core, the RSAP is a regional framework to guide how we address sea level rise across the Bay Area. It was built through a collaborative process with input from local governments, community organizations, scientists, and regional partners. So the RSAP does three main things. First, it lays out a one bay vision, which is a shared community-centered vision for a resilient and thriving bay shoreline. Second, it defines 8 strategic regional priorities, the key issues we all need to plan for, including habitat, infrastructure, equity, and more. And third, it includes the subregional plan guidelines, which outline what's required in subregional plans under SB 272. Plans aren't a one size fits all, but the RSAP does help us all move in the same direction together. Now that we've covered the RSAP at a high level, let's take a closer look at the subregional plan guidelines. Think of the guidelines as a roadmap for creating a subregional plan that provide a comprehensive approach to sea level rise adaptation planning. It's also important to note that the guidelines focus on considerations and outcomes rather than prescribing a single process. They describe both a step-by-step planning approach and alternative paths to compliance, recognizing that jurisdictions may want to shape their planning process based on local context, capacity, and preferences. For jurisdictions that have never done adaptation planning before, we strongly recommend following the process laid out in the plan elements. If a jurisdiction would like to use an alternative methodology or process, there are sidebars throughout the guidelines that suggest alternative paths to compliance, and BCDC staff is available to work with you to identify a satisfactory approach. The guidelines are structured around two main components, subregional plan elements and minimum standards. So regional plan elements are the main sections of a plan. So each element focuses on a specific topic, follows specific guidelines, and together they build a complete and cohesive plan. Minimum standards are the minimum requirements across those elements. They help ensure plans are technically sound, grounded in best available data, and consistent across jurisdictions. Finally, the guidelines include a subregional plan checklist, which jurisdictions can use to confirm that their plans meet all required elements and standards, even if the structure or approach of the plan looks a little different. Before diving into the individual plan elements, it's helpful to understand the reasoning behind how the guidelines are structured. So the guidelines follow a familiar planning framework for ease of use. They allow you to build on existing work so jurisdictions can incorporate studies and assessments that they've already completed. They're designed to address both local and regional risks, helping plans respond to community needs while remaining consistent across the Bay, and they center communities, making sure local priorities and inputs are reflected throughout the planning process. With this foundation in mind, we can now look at the specific plan elements and how each one contributes to a complete subregional plan. So there are 7 elements, A through G, that together make up a complete subregional plan. Element A spans the entire plan and documents the full planning process, showing how the plan was developed and who was involved. Elements B and C help you understand the local context, including existing conditions and community vulnerabilities. Finally, elements D through G focus on selecting adaptation strategies and advancing them towards implementation. This structure ensures that each plan not only reflects local conditions, but also follows a consistent framework that aligns with regional priorities. Next, let's look at the minimum standards. These are the essential requirements that every subregional plan must meet. They provide a consistent foundation across the region and are referenced throughout the plan elements. And there are 4 key standards. First, the coastal flood hazards and sea level rise scenarios. Plans must include these hazards and sea level rise scenarios at a minimum, although local jurisdictions may include additional coastal hazards and sea level rise scenarios beyond these in their plans. Second are the minimum categories and assets. These are designed to set minimum standards for the region to assess risk and ensure adaptation strategies and pathways are responsive to essential assets and services. Local governments are encouraged to incorporate additional assets that are locally identified within their planning process that go beyond the minimum standards as identified by their communities. Third is the equity assessment. This ensures plans evaluate impacts on vulnerable populations and integrate equity throughout the planning process. Finally, are the adaptation strategy standards. These guide the selection of strategies that are practical, effective, and promote long-term resilience. Taken together, these standards maintain consistency across jurisdictions, establish a regional baseline, and ensure that plans are scientifically sound, equitable, and actionable. Now, for a high-level look at the formal process of approval. Every plan begins with a notice of intent, followed by consultations with BCDC to confirm alignment with the guidelines. Over the next few years, local teams will develop and refine their plans, integrating technical data, community input, and project priorities. Once adopted, plans must be updated at least every 10 years, ensuring that these plans are living documents. Next, let's look at some resources to support subregional planning. The Adaptation Roadmap is a practitioner's guide that walks you through moving from understanding climate risks to identifying and implementing shoreline adaptation actions. We'll be diving into this resource more in the next slide. The Community Vulnerability and Community-Based Organizations Directory Map, or CBO directory, is an interactive tool that highlights community vulnerabilities and identifies local organizations. The RSAP Atlas is a regional mapping tool that currently includes about 65% of the data needed for a subregional plan. We'll discuss these 2 resources in more detail in the upcoming sections as they relate to specific plan elements. While created prior to the RSAP, the Adaptation Roadmap can help jurisdictions understand how to implement some of the aspects of subregional planning. The roadmap is a guide and includes worksheets to help jurisdictions understand and incorporate complex decision-making into planning under uncertainty and changing conditions. It can help jurisdictions understand how to collaborate across departments and neighboring communities, showing ways to work together effectively. It can also help jurisdictions understand how to consider equity and integrate community perspectives into planning and decision making. And it can serve as a helpful reference for future plan elements beyond A and B, offering guidance on adaptation strategies and implementation. It is important to note, however, that because the roadmap was created prior to the RSAP, following it may not fully meet all RSAP requirements. So jurisdictions should use it as a reference and supplement it with RSAP specific guidance where needed to ensure compliance with the guidelines. Throughout the webinar, call out boxes will highlight where the roadmap can be especially helpful, illustrating practical ways to apply it in your planning efforts. And finally, bringing you back to this graphic, I want to highlight that the next two sections will focus on element A, the planning process, and element B, existing conditions, since these are likely the steps jurisdictions are working on or considering starting. The remaining elements, C through G, will be covered in future webinars as you move further along in the planning process. And before I hand it over to Juliet, we want to hear about where you are in the planning process. Are you working on element A, maybe B, or maybe you haven't started quite yet? Please go ahead and drop your answer in the chat, and we'll just take a moment to see what everyone is saying. Seeing working on elements A and B, mapping valuable assets, just starting elements B and C. No wrong answers. Don't be shy. Not started. Lots of finalizing grant stuff. Okay, great. Oh, B and C. Okay, amazing. Well, thank you everyone for sharing. This gives us, a little insight into where everyone is in the process. And now I'm gonna hand it over to Juliet, who will guide us through the next section and dive a little deeper into the planning process.
Thanks, Sabrina. Hi, everybody. I'm Juliet Chawson, and I'm a Senior Climate Adaptation Planner here at BCDC. And in this section, I'll walk you through Element A, the planning process. So we'll cover what goes into documenting your planning process, why it's important for creating a comprehensive and actionable subregional plan. So the purpose of Element A, the planning process, is to document how your plan is designed, implemented, and carried out. The element focuses on your process, not just checking boxes. It helps ensure a meaningful and robust planning process that engages a mix of government departments, community members, tribes, and local interested and affected parties. It also promotes inclusion of historically underrepresented communities in decision-making and provides transparency and accountability, showing clearly how your plan was developed. So it's important to note that Element A can't be completed until the end of your planning process because it reflects everything that happened along the way. Element A is broken into several sections. So the first section, A1, Subregional Partners, is where you list who's involved in developing the plan. This includes the jurisdictions, the planning project team members, and any affected parties. Then section A2 is your planning area map. So you would include a map of your planning area. And based on the sea level rise minimum standards, the landward boundary of your map must include at least the 6.6 foot or 2100 high scenario. Section A3 focuses on multi-jurisdictional coordination. And in this section, you would describe the process for coordinating across jurisdictions, including other cities and counties, tribal governments, and special districts. And then finally, section A4 is the equitable engagement, and this is where you would identify vulnerable communities and summarize your efforts to engage communities equitably throughout your planning process. The equity assessment standard outlines several steps that need to be taken to ensure equity in this process, and we're mentioning this here at a high level today, but our webinar in April will dive into equity and the equity assessment in detail, so make sure to sign up for that. So diving deeper into Section A1, there are several pieces that must be included. When you first start out your planning process, you must decide if your plan is a single jurisdiction plan or a multi-jurisdictional effort. Consider assessing whether shoreline processes, flood pathways, critical infrastructure, or governance extend beyond jurisdictional boundaries. While all subregional plans are required to coordinate with neighboring jurisdictions, multi-jurisdictional planning can provide added value where shared risk and adaptation strategies benefit from being addressed at the ecosystem or landscape scale rather than political boundaries. Next, you must include your project planning team, and it's important here to make sure that your team represents different government sectors, advisory groups, and key partners. You can find a more robust list of potential planning team members in the guidelines text. You must also describe how you're including diverse perspectives on the team and how language services are integrated into the planning effort. When approaching this, think about building a mix of experienced stakeholders and emerging partners so the team reflects the makeup of your planning area. Consider who's impacted, who is influenced, and who has historically been underrepresented. In the next slide, I'll dive into our Community-Based Organization Directory, or CBO directory, which is a great starting point to help identify these parties. Next, you must identify affected and interested parties in your planning area who should be incorporated into outreach and engagement efforts, including, at a minimum, special districts, asset owners, operators, and managers, major landowners, industries, or businesses, tribes, both federally recognized and non-federally recognized, neighborhoods, communities, community groups, or CBOs, and environmental organizations. And the CBO directory can be a really great resource for this as well. Lastly, you must describe how government-to-government consultation was conducted with affected tribes in the region. And remember, you should be consulting tribes early and often, and consider inviting them to participate on your planning team or your technical advisory committee. Okay, so let's dive into the Community Vulnerability and Community-Based Organization Directory, or CBO directory, that I mentioned. The CBO directory is a directory of Bay Area community-based organizations linked to community vulnerability data. It highlights organizations serving socially vulnerable populations. You can search the directory to find organizations by location and community served. It's a useful starting point to find and reach out to partners for planning and engagement in your community. Integrating CBO input into planning decisions and participation on your technical advisory committee is another great way to ensure that community voices are represented in your plan. It's also worth noting that the CBO directory is not just a standalone resource. These data layers are embedded within our online mapping tool called the RSAP Atlas, so you can access them alongside other planning information if you'd prefer to work within a single platform. Section A2 is where you would include a map of your planning area. Your map must extend bayward from the shoreline to include relevant subtidal areas, and landward from the shoreline to include the maximum coastal flood hazard area extent of the 2100 high scenario, which assumes 6.6 feet of sea level rise. And your map must also show all participating jurisdictions. The RSAP Atlas is a publicly available online mapping tool that can help you map your planning area and visualize these boundaries. And when developing your map, you may also consider the Operational Landscape Unit, or OLU, that your jurisdiction falls in and how your planning area aligns with its boundaries. Like we mentioned in A1, risk analysis and adaptation strategies may benefit from being addressed at an ecologically meaningful scale rather than political boundaries, and an OLU is just the way of doing that. Okay, so let's take a quick sidebar and talk about OLUs. OLUs, or Operational Landscape Units, are essentially areas with specific ecosystem functions and services, and they can be defined by natural features such as tides, waves, and sediment movement. The boundaries of OLUs around the bay were developed by the San Francisco Estuary Institute. Because each OLU shares landscape features and ecosystem functions, that makes it a natural unit for management. OLUs also vary widely in size. Some span multiple jurisdictions, and others may split a single jurisdiction into multiple OLUs. They often extend further inland than traditional shoreline boundaries because they account for how shoreline systems interact with upstream watersheds and upland areas, and they capture the importance of these upland areas for adaptation, including marsh migration, for example. Using OLUs can help communities plan for sea level rise in a coordinated, ecosystem-based way, ensuring that adaptation actions account for how the landscape functions as a whole. Looking at adaptation from the OLU scale also highlights the importance of multi-jurisdictional collaboration, because the natural system crosses jurisdictional lines and adaptation actions in one place can affect conditions elsewhere. This approach helps move planning beyond political boundaries and towards solutions that work at the scale of the shoreline system. We ask that you at least understand which OLU your planning area falls into so that you can be aware of how the system functions outside of your political boundaries. I also want to take a second to highlight that the San Francisco Estuary Institute has several products that take the OLU concept one step further towards adaptation. One example is the Shoreline Adaptation Atlas that we've highlighted on this slide, and it essentially evaluates suitable locations for a subset of natural and nature-based adaptation measures within each OLU and can be a great starting point for your adaptation strategy development. Next, Section A3 focuses on multi-jurisdictional coordination. So your plan should describe the coordination process across jurisdictions, including how points of coordination were addressed, such as shared landscape features or cross-jurisdictional projects, and how other jurisdictions were incorporated into the plan. As a reminder, coordination is required for all plans, not just multi-jurisdictional ones. So when you're approaching this, think about it broadly. This section is intended to ensure strong collaboration starts from the beginning. Consider all of your neighboring jurisdictions, counties, tribes, special districts, and private entities that share landscape features or infrastructure, and look for opportunities to align planning processes from the start. Consider engaging regional entities or federal agencies that may be able to provide support or frameworks for such collaborative planning. Including these groups on your technical advisory committee, holding quarterly meetings, or setting up other regular touch points to gather input throughout the planning process is a great start. Finally, Section A4 focuses on equitable engagement and highlights which plan elements you should be conducting outreach for at a minimum. Your plan should define and identify vulnerable populations, which is an umbrella term that we use to include socially vulnerable communities, environmental justice communities, and tribes. It should also include a map and a description of community characteristics. This is another place where the CBO directory can be helpful, both for identifying vulnerable populations as well as for finding relevant community-based organizations to partner with. You also must provide a summary of equitable outreach and engagement efforts, including any funding allocations that supported engagement. Allocating budget and resources early is a great way to support engagement, and that could include funding for translation, stipends, or childcare. Additionally, multiple engagement methods, including in-person and virtual meetings, accessible locations and meeting times, and multilingual materials can help improve reach. We recognize that some jurisdictions may have already recently conducted community engagement to understand local values, important assets, community vision, or priorities. And if those efforts are relatively recent, then they can help fulfill some of these requirements as long as they're clearly documented and relevant to this planning process. You'll notice that the equity assessment is embedded in this section to help ensure that your plan captures diverse perspectives, includes multilingual communities, and promotes tribal and community partnership. We recommend reaching out directly to CBOs, neighborhood groups, and elderly homes as just a few suggestions to ensure that they're aware of and engaged in your planning efforts. And finally, be sure to document your engagement along the way by keeping notes, attendance sheets, and outreach summaries. That makes it easier to include in your plan and supports transparency in how decisions were made. Okay, now that we've gone over element A, let's take a moment to hear from you. How prepared does your team feel to start element A, the planning process? Type your answer in the chat, either not yet, ready to begin, or underway, and we'll take a moment to pause and see what everybody's saying. All right, I'm seeing a mixture of underway, ready to begin, not yet. All right, everybody, keep them coming. All right, thanks for sharing, everyone. This gives us a great sense of where everyone is starting in element A and helps us continue to provide resources to help you move forward. And now I'll pass it off to Todd, who will walk us through part 3.
Thanks, Juliet. So I'm Todd Hollenbeck, GIS Specialist Lead at BCDC. And in this section, we'll be covering part 3, element B, existing conditions. So we're going to walk through how to understand and document your local context, including community, environmental, and infrastructure conditions. Element B focuses on existing conditions. Its purpose is to identify the baseline local conditions that shape vulnerability and adaptation decisions in your planning area. This element brings together physical and ecological, social and policy contexts, so jurisdictions have a shared understanding of the current conditions along their shoreline. That includes what assets and systems exist today, how the landscape functions, and how people and communities interact with these places. Element B also helps connect local conditions to the RSAP's strategic regional priorities. The information documented here helps jurisdictions understand how those regional priorities show up locally, where risks are concentrated, and where there are opportunities to align local action with regional goals. Much of this information already exists in other local or regional plans, studies, and data sets that you gathered in Element A, and jurisdictions don't need to recreate this work. Relevant existing plans and analyses can be used and cited to meet Element B requirements, as long as they're clearly documented and applicable to the planning area. Element B also directly informs the next steps in the planning process. The information documented here is used to support Element C, the vulnerability assessment, and Element D, adaptation strategies. This element matters because it grounds the plan in real documented conditions, helping jurisdictions identify risks, opportunities, and constraints early in the process. It also supports adaptation strategies that are realistic, implementable, and responsive to community needs, including equity considerations rather than abstract or one-size-fits-all solutions. Element B is organized into 3 sections that together describe existing conditions in the planning area. B1 focuses on plans, policies, and context. This section lists and describes existing plans, studies, and other relevant information that may affect how the region addresses coastal flooding hazards. So this includes general and land use plans, hazard and emergency plans, as well as climate and resilience plans. The goal is to understand what already exists, how it can be reused, and how it shapes current and future decisions. B2 covers the physical and ecological conditions. The section maps and describes the physical and ecological characteristics of the landscape within the planning area. That includes shoreline features, baylands, waterways, habitats, and other natural systems that influence flooding and ecosystem function. These conditions help establish how the landscape behaves today. B3 focuses on communities, assets, and systems. This section maps and describes existing populations, assets, sectors, services, and land uses within the planning area. And B3 establishes who and what may be affected by coastal flooding hazards. Additionally, minimum standard requirements are woven through both B2 and B3. B3 must include all minimum categories and assets identified in the guidelines and must complete the equity assessment. Altogether, the information in element B is critical for understanding who and what may be affected by coastal flooding hazards and for ensuring that equity considerations are integrated early in the planning process. Before we dive into the sections of element B, let's take a moment to review the minimum categories and assets. Here's a quick refresher of the extent of data required to be considered and documented in element B. The minimum categories and assets standard outlines the key types of physical, environmental, social, and economic systems that every subregional plan must consider. That includes critical infrastructure and services, housing development and land use, transportation and transit, shoreline contamination, to name a few. Together, these categories help ensure that adaptation planning reflects what communities rely on, what is most at risk, and what should be prioritized for protection or investment. While these data requirements may seem extensive, requiring all plans to include them ensures that plans can speak to one another across the region and that key categories aren't overlooked. So B1 focuses on documenting existing plans, policies, and context. You will start by identifying relevant plans, studies, codes, and processes that address coastal flooding hazards, including general plans, hazard mitigation, climate and resilience plans, and summarizing how flooding and adaptation are currently referenced or addressed, as adaptation is often woven into many different plans. This will allow you to start with what already exists from those plans, processes, and relationships, and integrate current work into your subregional plan for alignment and to avoid duplicating efforts. Guidelines are written flexibly to allow existing work to fulfill requirements wherever possible. Use this section to highlight alignment gaps and opportunities, and to build on existing relationships while investing time on forming new long-term partnerships. Sharing consistent adaptation information across plans, agencies, and sectors will support more effective implementation and help ensure inclusive and equitable decision-making throughout the planning process. B2 focuses on documenting the physical and ecological conditions of the planning area. This includes mapping and describing physical features, coastal and nearshore hydrology, ecosystem health and resilience, historical conditions, and planned future changes. When approaching this section, start by drawing from already developed existing condition reports or other available resources to avoid duplicating effort. Next, we recommend using the RSAP Atlas to understand the extent of data that it already contains and filling gaps from there. Overall, as mentioned, it holds about 65% of the data you need to complete this section. We will dive more into how to use the Atlas so you understand its capabilities. The different categories that must be mapped in this section do not need to be individual maps. They can be displayed in combined maps or organized in ways that make sense for your planning area. Additionally, this section can be used to highlight correct connections across habitats, jurisdictions, and uses. Documenting physical and ecological conditions in this way helps establish a clear understanding of the landscape and supports later sections on vulnerability assessment and adaptation strategy development. B3 focuses on mapping and describing existing populations, assets, sectors, services, and land uses within the planning area. This section establishes a detailed, place-based understanding of who and what exists today and how communities and systems currently function along the shoreline. B3 is organized across several condition areas, including community health and well-being, development, housing and land use, critical infrastructure and services, public access and recreation, transportation and transit, shoreline contamination, and collaborative governance, flood management, and funding. When approaching this section, start by using existing conditions reports or information already developed through other planning efforts. The RSAP Atlas can be used to map these conditions, and your output can combine multiple conditions to a single map where appropriate. Equity is integrated throughout B3 and must be addressed within each category. Together, the information in B3 provides the foundation for identifying differential impacts and supporting equitable adaptation decisions in later plan elements. Now to dive a bit deeper into RSAP Atlas. The the Atlas is a mapping tool developed to support implementation of the RSAP and to help with the preparation of subregional plans. So the Atlas brings together region-wide data on coastal flood hazards, community vulnerability, existing conditions, strategic regional priorities, and nature-based adaptation suitability. It includes data from over a dozen agency partners, including NOAA, USGS, ABAG, MTC, and is designed to ensure consistency with RSAP guidelines. For element B in particular, the Atlas can help jurisdictions map and document physical, ecological, and community conditions in a consistent way across the region. The tool allows users to explore how sea level rise may affect their planning area, generate maps and materials to support plan submittals, and download GIS data for further analysis or integration with other datasets. And the RSAP Atlas is updated periodically as new science becomes available. So now we'll dive into a short demo so you can understand and see how to utilize this tool for your work. Understanding today's shoreline conditions is critical to plan for future impacts. The RSAP Element B requires local governments to look at physical, social, and ecological conditions along the shoreline and review current plans and policies to make sure adaptation efforts are effective. The Atlas supports Element B through the Plan Assistant by providing data about physical, ecological, and social conditions. First, you can select your jurisdiction type. In jurisdiction, in this example, we're going to be planning for the county of Marin. Next, let's select Element B and a topic to get started. In this example, we're going to be mapping ecosystem health and resilience conditions. Tables here provide lists or summaries of assets to help you describe existing conditions. These tables also highlight where an asset represents a strategic regional priority, and these can be exported as CSVs. Layers can be turned on and off, and you can understand the symbology by scrolling the legend. Maps can be exported with the print tool. An error may occur when trying to use the print tool due to request size limitations. Try reducing the number of layers, zooming in, or capturing the area with a screenshot instead. The Atlas does not include all information needed to create a plan. For example, the Atlas does not include layers on existing rocky intertidal reefs and other required assets due to a lack of regionally available information. Local governments must make meaningful efforts to collect this data locally. To learn more about the RSAP planning process and other resources to help you get started, please visit BCDC's Local Sea Level Rise Plans webpage. So hopefully that was helpful. There's a number of other user guides within the RSAP Atlas that can help walk through steps within the planning process and how the Atlas supports them. For most jurisdictions, the existing conditions requirements in Element B can be met using data provided in the RSAP Atlas and additional existing local or regional resources. However, in some cases, jurisdictions may want or need to use alternative or supplemental data for their area. If you do need to use alternative or supplemental data, you must submit a written request to BCDC. The request should describe the data and explain how it meets the best available data criteria outlined in section 3.1.2 of the RSAP guidelines. For the purposes of the RSAP, best available data is evaluated based on criteria adapted from the Delta Stewardship Council's Delta Plan, including its relevance, inclusiveness, objectivity, transparency, accessibility, timeliness, peer review, and regional applicability. Our team will review the request and provide a written response within 30 days. If a request is denied, local governments may appeal that decision. As plans are beginning to be initiated, some data have already been pre-approved for use in the region. So recently we approved City of San Mateo to use a data set from SFEI and Climate Pathways in 2022 representing their shallow groundwater rise future conditions for the counties of San Mateo, Alameda, San Francisco, Contra Costa, and Solano. Using pre-approved data does not require a full request, but jurisdictions must notify BCDC by email with the plan name, lead contact, data source, whether it is an alternative or supplemental data set, and which RSAP minimum category or asset it applies to. Overall, this approval process helps ensure that any alternative or supplemental data is used consistently and transparently across plans. To support jurisdictions, BCDC has developed a data request form that guides you through, the simple documentation and submittal requirements for those alternative and supplemental data. The form and instructions are linked here and also available on our website. And so with that, I will pass it back to Dana to close us out.
Thanks, Todd. So let's go to our takeaways. Before we move on to resources and next step, we want to make sure that you understand that the RSAP and plan guidelines provide a consistent regional framework while letting jurisdictions build on local data, plans, and partnerships. That element A and B help capture the planning process and existing conditions, assets, and governance to understand current risks and community needs. And documenting these conditions ensures that your plan reflects real-world challenges and supports equitable decision makings. So these takeaways reinforce that starting with a strong foundation is critical. And in addition to the resources we presented in this webinar, we have other resources for you. We're here to help during your planning by providing a dedicated liaison for your county. We have resources on our website to help you advance planning, and we have a plan tracker that allows you to track sub-regional plan process in the region. And lastly, as some next steps, please take our feedback survey on this webinar. If you haven't already, please register for our next webinar on March 25th that focuses on element C, the vulnerability assessment. And if you haven't already, sign up for our newsletters to stay informed about future webinars, which cities are initiating plans, and other resources that become available. And lastly, if you missed our summer webinar series from last year, you can always catch up on past webinars on our YouTube channel.